Welcome to the fifth and final episode of my historical exploration series on the graveyard from the massively multiplayer text-based game GemStone III. I'm your host, the player Xorus. In this episode I will try to theorize the grand design of the graveyard, unifying the previous episodes within a single framework. It is an allegorical interpretation in terms of real-world literature and comparative mythology. Weird and wild stuff, let me tell you. It is either dead on right, or an utterly, diabolically clever way of being completely wrong, with emphasis on the word diabolical, as you will see. In the fourth episode on Death and Gemstone, we began dealing with the issue of out-of-game references. That is, there seem to be higher concepts in the graveyard and Gemstone's death mechanics, which, instead of being limited to the Shadow World setting, are leaning into real-world concepts like medieval feudalism and theology, in enough detail that we have to take it seriously as possibly being allusions rather than inspired by or vaguely reminiscent of. We also noted some subtle things done with words in 1990, such as the presence of medieval terms or Gaelic languages. The Deed Priestess, Tyrian Bithronian of Ubel, in this context, might be more meaningfully pronounced Tyrian Bithronian of Ubel, where Ronion is very similar in pronunciation to Rhiannon, one of the GMs from 1990, which is a figure from Welsh mythology. The gist of it would be eternity and the otherworld, those notions put together. Possibly even a very cryptic reference to purgatory. There was also apparently some influence from various eldritch horror stories by H.P. Lovecraft, especially stories involving Nyarlathotep and Yog-Sothoth, very powerful demonic other gods. Nyarlathotep is the messenger and soul of the demon sultan Azathoth, who is sort of like the Unlife, the nethermost unthinking chaos, with his demonic court of amorphous gibbering dancers, and Yog-Sothoth is the guardian of forbidden knowledge, existing outside time and space. The Dark Path is fundamentally about forbidden knowledge. Nyarlathotep has contempt for his masters and a mocking sense of humor, much as does Bander, our analog for Nyarlathotep. So, part of the grand design of the graveyard was established in the death episode. Our theory is that the landing temple death mechanics in the graveyard are inverted images or mirrors of each other, representing rival death religions for the fate of souls. That the graveyard is symbolically a backwards mockery of the gates of oblivion and purgatory, with the city of the dead in everlasting existence on the other side of the gates, and only the dark path in purgatory literally blocking out the light. The deep underground of the graveyard represents Gemstone's purgatory as a medieval manor. I pointed out that this was not just vaguely, generically medieval. It appears to be historically informed, albeit some of the details are backwards. There are various wordplays or puns involving castle terminology. The storeroom and solar room are backwards from where they should be relative to the dais and banquet hall. Instead of being called a solar room, it is called a cabinet, which is an analogous later term for the private chambers of the lord of the manor. This is a pun. The cabinet is represented as a food pantry. Totally different meaning of the word. It is also leading down into darkness, which could be an implicit play off the solar, which has disputed etymology out of Latin, either solaris, meaning sun, the brightest room, or solus, meaning alone. Cabinet rooms are also meant to be smaller so they are easier to keep warm, whereas in the graveyard it is kept cold by the larder, which is where Bander resides, in the meat freezer. The entrance separating a great hall from a kitchen, pantry, larder area is called the Screens Passage. In the graveyard this is made literal. The grating is a pun for Screens Passage. Down below in the larder, there is a slab of ice next to Bandar, like a sacrificial offering table. These were called thralls in central England. Again, another pun. The dark past form of feudalism is called thraldom. These could be coincidences, of course, but it would be a remarkable cluster of coincidences, especially considering how naturally it explains the grating and slab of ice, which are odd details in isolation without that context. So that raises the question of whether there are such subtleties in the crypt and burial mound. And the answer is yes, those appear to be informed by history and archaeology as well. In this episode, we will take them literally, as if they were an Egyptian mastaba and a passage barrow crossed with a Viking ship burial. But what does it all mean? Why these things put together? So, from episodes 2 and 3, we dealt with the weirdness of how Empress Kadaena is dead, but is treated as the subject of homage by a theocracy 100,000 years later in the Wars of Dominion, as if she were a dead goddess and a rival goddess of death. In the Book of Revelation subtext from episode 4, if Issa is death, that would imply Empress Kadaena is Hades. We also noticed the crypt might be influenced by the Black Hell theocracy ruled by Kadaena's daughter, where Hell is spelled like the Viking goddess Hel, whose body appears half dead. And like Hades, Hel is essentially Lord of the Underworld. Maybe you can see where this is heading. In the Lovecraft frame for Purgatory, with the end scene of the dream quest of unknown Kadath, before Randolph Carter leaps into the darkness, we encounter the human manifestation of Nyarlathotep. He is represented as a cross between an Egyptian pharaoh and a fallen archangel. Notice how reminiscent his eyes and robes are to how Bandar is described. And more subtle is this line about the Lethean streams. Lethe is the river of oblivion from Greek mythology. The word is literally ancient Greek for forgetfulness or oblivion. Drinking it causes complete forgetfulness, and its sound would cause drowsiness. Hence this line about the mild music of Lethean streams, with this taking place in the Dreamlands. Lethe and Melanthia, of course, is the spirit Beris in the Ice Age, whose tears, if Eos allows him to cry, raise the dead. Incidentally, in Shadowworld, this would arguably be the River of Life by analogy, in which case, in the Book of Revelation frame of reference, we could interpret the throne of human ivory as the analog of the throne of God at Judgment Day, where souls are sorted to salvation and damnation according to their deeds, because the Book of Life and the River of Life are both next to the throne of God. Lovecraft may have been aware that in the last chapter of Dante's Inferno, Canto 34, it is implied Lethe flows down from Purgatory, where it forms the frozen lake of Cocytus, where Satan is frozen in solid ice in the center of the earth. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Bandar is frozen in a block of ice deep underground, the sarcophagus of his own devising, since he's not actually in the sarcophagus in the crypt. Inferno begins with Dante being lost in the gloomy woods, unable to find the straight way, then finds his way to a desert, the gate of hell and the blessed women, just like the entrance of the graveyard. But as I will argue, the Inferno parallel holds up even further than those points. So, Nyarlathotep is a cross between an Egyptian pharaoh and a fallen archangel. We have Hades from Revelation and Satan from Dante's Inferno, and we have Hell from the Vikings. These are all deity concepts involving the underworld. The Egyptian death religion, of course, is all about the underworld, where Osiris is a dead god and the first pharaoh. This forms our fundamental allegorical premise for the higher concept or grand design of the graveyard. The formula is dead or fallen god of the underworld, involving a gate of the underworld. With the Dreamlands, you have the gates of deeper slumber in Nyarlathotep. Satan has the gates of Inferno, Hell has the Hell Gate, Osiris with the gates of the underworld, such as in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Hades from Greek mythology also involves gates to the underworld. While Hades is not a dead god, Hades is cast into the lake of fire at Judgment Day in Revelation, when the records of people's names and deeds are read from the Book of Life. There will also be a dimension to it involving the sun. So, this is our basic allegorical framework, real-world literature and comparative mythology. This is much more daring than what was done in the previous episodes. It is purely at the level of subtext, hidden, crypto-history. While there is no way to prove it, we can take the parallels seriously and see how well they hold up. Specifically interpreting the Egyptian parts of the graveyard as if they were literally Egyptian, the burial mound as literally Viking, and the whole graveyard as Dante's Inferno. The episode neatly divides into those major sections: Lovecraft's slumbering horrors, the Egyptian underworld, the Viking hell, and Dante's Inferno. These will be used to explain the design of the distinct sections of the graveyard, as well as various aspects of the legend of the necropolis of Etrurion, which was partly addressed for Lovecraft in the Death episode. So let's go back to Lovecraft first and look more closely, within reason, since Nyarlathotep seems to be a nexus point, linking multiple subtexts together. The excerpts I held up for words influencing the Purgatory throne room were not random. They were from scenes or stories with specific situations in common. One was from The Haunter of the Dark, another was from earlier in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Both of these were immediately following a very similar description of Azathoth and Nyarlathotep, which is the doom that Randolph Carter is fleeing at the end of the Dream Quest. That is, when Carter is almost lost to the demonic, literally, to the demon sultan Azathoth in his court of madness. Where, as I argued, the language from that scene is where most of the purgatory messaging comes from. The doom and dreams and creeping course of eternity, the montage of colors and presences, the word futile instead of hopelessness, and returning to his body. The demonic court of madness is, I would argue, not just generic Lovecraft imitation. It is more specifically a feudalistic allegory for the demon sultan Azathoth, where Bander, by analogy, is the earthly messenger for the unlife. So, early in the Dream Quest is the enchanted forest of phosphorescent fungus, inhabited by cannibals known as ghouls, where one was once a human named Pikmin. Dreamers from Earth can exist after death in the Dreamlands, and the ghouls also reside in the Underworld. So there's an afterlife element in the story built into it, not including the Lethean streams with Nyarlathotep, which for us links that end scene to oblivion. But this glowing fungus is right after the Azathoth description, which itself follows a paragraph on the cold castle of Kadath, described as made of onyx and having unimagined stars. Where Kadath is where Carter eventually finds the Dreamling gods to be missing, and encounters Nyarlathotep with the leap into darkness. These details, combined with the gibbering dancers by themselves, explains much of the purgatory section of the graveyard, the glowing fungus and cannibals and so on. So, in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Nyarlathotep is an external force and appears to Carter in his human form at the end. While in the Haunter of the Dark, Nyarlathotep is a dark manifestation, and here is possessing the narrator. Thus, the language comes from sections of stories not only with Nyarlathotep mentioned, but the scenes where Nyarlathotep actually appears, which is very rare in Lovecraft stories. In the Rats in the Wall cannibal scene I showed, it is soon followed with the same basic crawling chaos description, except Nyarlathotep is conflated with Azathoth and represented as at the center of the earth, where Dante portrayed Satan as imprisoned, as Lovecraft surely knew. So there is a decent chance it is not random if these stories were actually used for their language, because they are all more specifically scenes involving Nyarlathotep. and perhaps more specifically encountering Nyarlathotep, Bandar being our Nyarlathotep analog. And opposite from the dream quest, plummeting into the darkness would bring you to him and your doom, lost to the demonic, rather than back to the waking world of your memories. By analogy, reincarnation, when Issa returns you to the living. Then, on the other hand, is Yog-Sothoth. The Dunwich horror involves two brothers of undistinguished lineage, in that respect like Bandar and Kestrel, and the attempted theft of the Necronomicon from the library of Miskatonic University, with the burglar alarm going off like Bandar getting caught in Namikos with the speaking crystal, which similarly possessed knowledge of a long-dead elder race from previous eons. The Necronomicon, by the way, was written by Abdul al-Hazred. The Enchiridion Valentia in Elanthea was written by Abdullahi Hazelred. Much more obvious Lovecraft allusion than any of the stuff I'm talking about here. That's also some wordplay. Valentia is the Latin root of valence. Enchiridion is Greek for a small handbook or manual. Vervis loaded the Fandral document with Easter eggs in Latin and Greek. Some of it even looks Indian. But Elizabeth Makra, the first Fandral to pierce the veil and went mad from it, is an anagram of Elizabeth Arkham. Makra is Arkham spelled backwards. The insane asylum from Batman, where Arkham is the Lovecraft town with Miskatonic University and the Necronomicon. Though these have no depth, they are just Easter eggs. Digression aside, the brothers in the Dunwich horror, the Whateleys, are the unnatural offspring of Yog-Sothoth. Yog-Sothoth is the guardian, gateway, and key of forbidden knowledge, existing outside of time. Azathoth does too, by the way. His court is outside of time. So, Yog-Sothoth is not directly encountered in that story, but the characters existed through interaction with Yog-Sothoth. While in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter encounters Nyarlathotep at the end, Carter instead encounters Yog-Sothoth at the end of Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which has Oblivion and witnessing many others, actually other versions of himself, in a void outside of time and space, as well as the word bewildered, like in our old reincarnation messaging. Purgatory recalls a timeless void. It feels like eternity, but you return to life the same instant you decayed. Carter is in a higher dimensional space, having vanished into thin air from Earth, having passed through a kind of gateway in a cave using an antique key. This is relevant, I think, to the Broken Lands. When encountering Yog-Sothoth, Carter is reincarnated into the form of an alien body in another solar system millions of years ago, possessing that analog of himself, as individuals are only manifestations of archetypes, and he is still in that body later in the story, and the people who knew him do not know it is him. That is, they do not recognize him because he's reincarnated differently. Reminiscent of what the hooded figure says about not recognize you when you have no deeds in the Landing Temple, that you could be brought back with a different face. But he is trapped in this otherworldly incarnation as he lacks sufficient esoteric knowledge to go back to Yog-Sothoth from the other way, so that he may incarnate his human body. He would need a parchment written in Relayan that came with the key, which he had left in his box back on Earth, for whatever reason, maybe by accident, where R'lyeh is the sunken city where the dead Cthulhu sleeps until the stars drift enough to return to their ancient constellations. And we see the throne room has constellations you have never seen as a horror motif on the tapestry behind the eldritch throne, though unfamiliar stars as a recurring motif, not specific to Cthulhu. It is remarkable that the Order of Vault step, where you have to walk down there with a candle votive, is worded as where death sleeps cold, both in the sense of Cthulhu, but also perhaps Kadaena as the dead sleeping queen in Demons of the Burning Night. And in any case, the dream subtext of the death mechanics. I will talk more about that task later, but with Cthulhu, there is the Necronomicon couplet in the Call of Cthulhu, That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. The Call of Cthulhu uses the word eldritch in the scene where the narrator encounters Cthulhu waking up. That is another rare situation of a Lovecraft story where a great old one is actually encountered. Though it must be said Lovecraft used eldritch in the leaping end scene of the Dream Quest as well as for describing the spaces outside our known universe in the context of Azathoth. I'm not suggesting eldritch here must have come from Cthulhu, but the paragraphs in Cthulhu around it are describing how space is warped and unnatural in Relie. Non-Euclidean geometry is very horrible for Lovecraft. Really, almost any solid shape is itself non-Euclidean, but we embed them in Euclidean space. John Nash, the mathematician from A Beautiful Mind, proved you can always embed it, that is, isometrically, preserving the lengths. But what's horrible to Lovecraft is being embedded within a non-Euclidean geometry, where the angles are wrong, triangles that do not add up to 180 degrees and so on, where the space itself is warped and wrong. What's relevant to us about this is that space is warped in the graveyard. For example, in this part of it you are moving northeast, but the room titles imply you're moving southwest. So it's quite plausible the graveyard space warps are intended as a Lovecraftian horror, the pure and total madness of it. Meanwhile, Yog-Sothoth is reached beyond the ultimate gate, beyond time and the last void, with the power to reincarnate the disembodied into horrible other forms, which gives us a potential death religion meaning for Kadaena as guardian of the forbidden, with the gates of the void and the forbidden key of the void. It would be interfacing with what we covered in the third episode about the soul becoming demonic and making the demonic artificially with dark and forbidden knowledge. The souls could be transformed into all sorts of horrible demonic powers as a demented kind of everlasting existence in the void, which would make Kadaena into a full dark mirror of what Issa does with reincarnation. In GemStone at least, not in Ken and Shadow World. Something else to consider about this is the fact that it involves Carter being moved back and forth across time. There was even another story, the Silver Key, between the Dream Quest and Through the Gates of the Silver Key. Carter is an old man. He goes into the cave and returns to his boyhood body. Then he lives his life over again, without remembering it, but with weird, unexplained abilities of premonition, and somehow intuitively knowing things before they happen. The relevance to us are the time paradoxes implicitly present in the graveyard, or Bander perhaps knowing things he should not have been able to know, at least not naturally, where it speaks of him having omens and so on. There is modern writing in the graveyard, for example, but the tombs in the bog are written in long-forgotten scripts, except those tombs are just as old as the monuments with the contemporary writing. Bander should not have known the two places where the Helm of Kadaena was hidden, and one of those was probably centuries after his own death. Moreover, the parallels of the graveyard to the temple and the landing would be recognizable to our characters. We can take them seriously. How is this guy from 6,000 years ago so directly paralleling the temple and the landing? Is the off-canon Issa death religion that immutable and predictable over millennia? Plus the time-delayed design features, like how he incorporates grave robbers into the graveyard. It isn't so much that a specific story has to be relevant as it is recognizing that there are impossible or implausible anachronisms. Impossibly out-of-place things, chronologically, is a horror element Lovecraft uses in multiple stories. In The Mound, for example, a story first published in full in that 1989 ghostwriting anthology, The Horror in the Museum, where the narrator descends into an earthen mound. Or in The Shadow Out of Time, where the narrator gets possessed, his consciousness swapped with an alien race from the far past. And in the end he finds writing in a metal case in millions-of-year-old runes, that is English and his own handwriting. You almost have to wonder if that Schalk manuscript in the crypt is even written in Heretic. The Shadow Out of Time is remarkable because the behavior of its narrator is so similar to Bander's when Kestrel was ruling. When Nathaniel Wingate Peasley is possessed, he's questing all over the world for obscure things. in contact with dubious, shadowy networks of occultists trying to acquire esoterica, building at one point a bizarre contraption of unknown purpose. It wrote corrections in the margins of Miskatonic University's Necronomicon through him at one point. Vastly accelerated rates of learning and very weird behaviors. In The Legend of the Necropolis of Etrivion, Bander's construction of demented edifices and monuments is characterized as satisfying the demands of the unlife upon him. There is some sense he is being directed on what is to be done. Wingate is also suffering from nightmare visions, like Bander, where he acquires unnatural knowledge, including knowledge of places he's never seen or heard of, as well as in the past or future. Bander even has a fit of possession when he slays Kestrel with Absolution Pure. Though, as I covered in the Death episode, Absolution Pure does not kill, so this detail is lying or probably intentionally wrong. But the point of it is that only a life-giving spell can fix Absolution Pure, which in the Shadowworld setting requires Issa, and there could be no clerics of Issa in his theocracy. They would have all been beheaded. Kestrel should have been in a coma from it, not actually slain. But then in GemStone, soul departure causes instant decay for characters, and that coma state does not happen for us. Maybe it would have killed Kestrel. In any case, another interesting quirk, if the Shadow Out of Time was used and applied to our Servants of the Shadow, the ancient aliens, the great race of Yith, survived their deaths by transferring their minds into the bodies of future races. They know their deaths in advance and escape them, which is an interesting potential loophole for the dead Kadaena, who would have had telepathic powers as a Kitavir. There's actually an almost unknown race sort of like this in the Shadowworld setting known as the Thalen. Their consciousness at death goes into inanimate objects, which then mystically impregnate females of other races later, even animals, mutating the offspring and hosting their own consciousness. Though I do not think that is actually relevant, but I thought I would mention it. So, what if this soul transference concept was used for when Bander gave his soul up to the powers it was promised to long ago? It could mean that some other entity, perhaps even Kadaena herself, is inside Bander's body in that block of ice, which is a recurring Lovecraftian horror motif itself. He does forms of it in The Thing on the Doorstep, Out of the Eons, The Whisperer in Darkness. With the everything is backwards motif and Bander suffering with guilt, the whole defiant Lord of the Underworld demonic thing could also be fake. That is, Kestrel's soul may have just gone to oblivion, and Bander decided to go with oblivion rather than eternal existence to end his suffering. And he's telling his high priest to not seek him if they value their lives, because they will be killed and devoured under the graveyard, but to not find him if they value their souls. This is a theocracy that turns its devout into undead, so that is an interesting threat coming from Bander. It could be taken literally, like if his self-immolation in ice is ordainer symbolism, because to ordain in that context means ripping souls out or destroying them. But it could also mean I'm with my brother in oblivion where everything ends. So, what about any other room painting details? One thing I've noticed is that the crypt is not solid slabs of granite, nor is it glued together with mortar. It is described as being fitted together cleverly with ponderous blocks of granite. Perhaps something too complicated for bones, but regardless. In the second episode I mentioned that it is wrong for the crypt to be made out of granite, in the sense that the high plateau is not made out of granite. The high plateau is limestone. What am I getting at? What is it called in archaeology when you build things by fitting together heavy blocks of limestone without using mortar? It's called Cyclopean masonry. Lovecraft uses Cyclopean masonry all the time for his horrible ruins of forgotten elder races. Cyclopean appears all over the place in his stories. What else? In the burial mound, there is the natural chimney, which is doubly weird. Both that there is a chimney and that it is natural. The chimney aspect of it I will explain later. But what's with natural? There is no way to tell whether one-off instances like this were intentional. But the natural chimneys are a place in Western Virginia. They are huge limestone monoliths. In the 19th century, the natural chimneys were instead called the Cyclopean Towers. That would be damned subtle, but you never know. For what it is worth, one of the places Wingate Peaslee goes while possessed is Western Virginia, exploring the vast limestone caverns. But even if both of these were used, a big if, that is almost certainly overthreading it, taking the parallels too far. There are also monoliths outside the burial mound. Curious way of wording a knocked-over dolmen. Since we're already talking about the burial mound, let's move on to trying to understand it more literally, in terms of archaeology and religious death symbolism. The burial mound in the graveyard appears to be a hybrid of two separate burial concepts. One is a passage burial mound or tumulus, which are usually Neolithic, that is, prehistorical Stone Age. Passage burials are more specifically one or more chambers with a narrow access passage made of large stones. Burial mounds exist all over the world. Passage burials are mostly, I think, in Western Europe. Cairns are when the passage grave is covered in stone instead of earth. When it is covered with earth, it is a kind of burial mound. So what we have in the graveyard is a passage burial mound, and tomb whites were originally called burial whites. But is it historically informed, or just vaguely reminiscent, being a mound with a tomb? This can be settled by looking at the passage aspect of it. To enter the burial mound, you have to walk through a stone corridor leading into the mound. This is done in the graveyard. It is the northeast passage past the crypt. But this is where things get more interesting. While large passage mounds are made with megaliths, the earliest ones took the form of small dolmens. That is, the passage is a linteled structure, like a dolmen or trilithon. There's a knocked-over dolmen next to the burial mound. The word dolmen is actually used. This is the funerary gate that the room painting suggests was meant to be a frame for looking at the mound through, and what I suggested could have been a trilithon-style Lord of Essence portal. These are also called portal dolmens when they are standalone. Surrounding stones have been stolen when they look this way. They're just the skeletons of the monuments. So we have a dolmen that is disconnected from a passage mound and knocked over. This is something that would seem to be intentionally wrong. Something else with passage graves is that the passage itself is often not randomly oriented. They are aligned so that the sun hits it, but only at a significant time of the year. That is, the sun penetrates into the interior, but only once a year, which is likely a fertility symbolism thing. Entrances being oriented toward the sun is very common in the history of religious architecture. The cromlechs might also be arrayed, for example, to track the passage of the moon. There can be religious architecture oriented for the stars as well, though the underbarrel makes a point of unknown constellations. When the entrances of passage barrels are oriented just right on the southeast, it is for the sunrise on the winter solstice. When they are oriented due west, like in the graveyard, it is for sunset on the equinox. In the graveyard, the dolmen is disconnected and knocked over, and the actual stone passage is underground, approaching from the southwest, so it is impossible for the sun to reach it. You also have to go up steps to enter the burial mound at the end of the corridor, making it even more impossible for light to make it through. So the passage mound in the graveyard is oriented antithetically, blocking out the sun. Light does enter the mound through the natural chimney exit, what might be a twist on the unique so-called roof box at the New Grange passage mound in Ireland, and as I suggested, might be slightly named after some huge monoliths. The light enters in a narrow beam from the ceiling, as opposed to horizontally by the doorway, so it probably cannot hit Kestrel's coffin. The space is also warped so that the southwest approach enters the burial chamber from its northwest corner. So even if the light could reach up that corridor, it's likely angled the wrong way. Meanwhile, you can only exit the chimney, not enter through it. These dolmens and passage mounds are mythologically associated with great warriors and giants and so on. The passage itself is symbolically a gateway to the otherworld, land of the living to the land of the dead. We see that the room painting inside the burial mound describes it as you question your sense of reality. And I pointed out with arrows the possible parallel with the storeroom in the landing temple, which has similar shifting light and explicitly uses the word otherworld. My gut is this aspect of the mound is supposed to be Celtic, but that is not the only archaeological dimension of the burial mound, which, as I said, appears to be a hybrid concept. The mound is in the form of a huge overturned warship. This is explicitly stated. Vikings made burial mounds in the shape of ships, but this was because they would bury warriors inside longboats as coffins by putting earth over them. There were also early stone ships where stones were arrayed in the outline of boats. Poorer people would have small mounds merely shaped like ships. Higher status people would be buried in actual boats. In the graveyard, it is a hybrid concept of a ship burial as a passage burial, and we see that Keshel's coffin is ship-shaped. What makes it more specifically Viking is the dragon prow on the coffin. Vikings were notorious for their dragon ships. Ship burials are oriented east-west like in the graveyard, though Kestrel is not at the prow of the burial mound. Vander instead put murals there implying he was responsible for Kestrel's warrior accomplishments, with perhaps the play on deeds meaning, look how many times Kestrel owed his continued life to my intercession. But the idea is the sunrise is rebirth and the sunset is death. That is, west is the direction of death. One aspect of Kestrel being Lord of the West Country, perhaps. So we are also encountering some things that are wrong in this context. The burial mound is pointing east and is made to look overturned, so that Kestrel is not sailing toward death. Ships are supposed to be about sailing safely to the afterlife, and that is the exact opposite of what the graveyard does with it. The Bellacorn ivory with his battle throne underscores this point. Bellacorn overturned ships and slaughtered the sailors. While the concept of Viking burial brings to mind putting someone on a boat and setting it on fire at sea, the way it usually worked for someone high status was burial in a boat, though being burned on a funeral pyre was also done, and maybe very rarely burned in the boat. That is almost certainly what the chimney in the burial mound is about. Kestrel's body, and I doubt that is really Kestrel, is not burned. If the body were burned in its tomb, it would block out the light from the smoke, which penetrates through the chimney. Ship burials were also done with grave goods, as we see inside the burial mound. And then there are some more subtle matters. One thing to notice is that the revenants were outside the burial mound. Revenants arguably come from Norse and Irish Celtic mythology, though the word is a generic term out of French. Creatures in the graveyard do not roam now the way they did decades ago. They used to be more confined to well-defined areas. That's where the revenants were located. Worth mentioning at least. Though I think their Rolemaster status as suicides will be what's relevant, which I will explain a bit later. So, Kestrel's death mask is more Egyptian than Viking, and the Egyptians used solar barges in their death rituals. This is something I will get into when addressing the Egyptian elements of the graveyard. There is also admixture the other way in the crypt. Notice that Banner's book in the crypt is subtitled Power Through Thraldom. Thralls were sometimes sacrificed and buried with their Viking masters. Thralls were the name of the Viking slave class. So, in the legend of the Necropolis of Etrivion, Kestrel gets restless and builds warships to raid the coastal settlements. This is essentially a Viking raider concept as opposed to the medieval feudalism stuff. What does Lord of the West Country mean in this context? One aspect of it might be that West Country is a phrase that refers to southwestern England, what in the so-called Dark Ages was the Kingdom of Wessex, the last kingdom, as it is called. This was the only Saxon kingdom that was not conquered by the Vikings. That would be backwards, so it is encouraging. Saxons made burial mounds up until the early Christian period, not all that long before the Viking invasions. So let's step back and consider what this would have to do with the Viking death religion. One aspect of the stone ship pattern is considered the journey to Hell, where Hell is the place of the dead who do not go to Valhalla, and Hell is ruled by the underworld goddess Hel. Hel as goddess is considered to possibly be an after-the-fact literary invention and personification of the location Hell. Hel as a personification, where half her face is black or dead, is only really fleshed out in one legend. The legend is called The Death of Balder in the Prose Edda. Wait, hold up. There's a dead Norse god named Balder? Yes, there is. He dies and goes to hell. Balder was suffering from nightmare visions of his own death, where dreams are taken to be prophetic. His mother made every object swear to not harm him, except mistletoe was missed or overlooked or something. Loki the trickster made a spear with mistletoe on the tip. Loki, by the way, is Hel's father. Since Balder could not die, the gods would throw objects at Balder, which bounced off him harmlessly. Then the blind god Hodor throws the spear and unintentionally kills Balder. This was a source of great despair, because Balder's death is the harbinger of Ragnarok, the apocalypse. This is where it gets especially relevant for us. Balder had the largest of all ships, and was ceremonially burned on the ship, which they initially could not budge into the water. This is perhaps opposite from the unburnt kestrel with the chimney in the huge ship-shaped burial mound. Thor also kicked a dwarf into the fire, and Balder's wife threw herself into the fire. So, Balder ends up in Hell with the underworld death goddess Hel. Odin then sent a rider down there on his own horse to offer Hel a ransom to return Balder. His horse actually leapt over the Hell gate, much as we leap over the gate of the graveyard when we climb over it. The rider, Hermod, told Hel how much Balder was wept for. Hel promised to release the dead god Balder if all objects, both living and dead, wept for him. And they all did, except for the giantess Thok, who's probably Loki in disguise. Loki ends up getting imprisoned until Ragnarok, with venom dripping on his face as punishment for it. For what it's worth, the underworld in Lovecraft's Dreamlands are the peaks of Thok or Throk, depending on which copy you're reading. And we have Kadaena Throk Farok in Graveyard as Heretic, though that is surely overthreading it. But, in any case, this speaks a lot toward having a huge ship burial mound, and an implication of burning the body on the ship. And it fits into our fundamental framework of the dead god of the underworld. Hel is not a dead goddess, strictly speaking, but Balder is a dead god. He is with Hel and not allowed to come out until Ragnarok. Balder obviously sounds an awful lot like Bandr. Something more subtle is that the Saxons, when they were pagan, had the Norse gods, but named in their West Germanic language. Wotan instead of Odin, Baldig instead of Balder. The Saxon kings were supposed to be descendants of Wotan through Baldig. Something else is that in the Great Heathen Army period of Wessex, the king Aethelwulf goes on a protracted journey to Rome. When he is away, he is usurped by his son Aethelbald. Wessex is divided between the east and the west when Aethelwulf returns. Aethelbald incidentally married his recent very young stepmother, Judith, daughter of Charles the Bald, king of the West Franks. I'm not going to strongly assert any of those details has to be relevant. They could just potentially fit. Something else is Kestrel's battlefield throne in the other room. The significant point of this is not so much the throne itself, but the wooden protective canopy over it. The canopies over thrones have a name. They're called baldaquins. Another sly play on words with medieval manor terms, perhaps. There's a real-world plant named after Balder called Balder's Brow, which I do not think exists in the game. But our eye restoral potions, Burr Clover, were originally called Baldaker potions. That's a Rollmaster term, and it restores sight in canon, but it's worth mentioning because there was at least some arbitrary discretion on which herbs to adapt for GemStone in 1990. You might wonder if Baldur's Gate from Forgotten Realms could be relevant to anything, like the spider silk on the rosary beads in the crypt. But as far as I can tell, the earliest appearance of Baldur's Gate is in the Forgotten Realms book from April 1990, which is not early enough to even be remotely possible as a factor. Spider silk isn't really a thing in Shadowworld, but there is a mention of the giant spiders being used for their silk in the bestiaries. They are also described as having originated in magical meddling. In the Shadowworld context, that suggests Lords of Essence, though it's not explicitly stated. Major spiders are even described in the Kelfor editions as having been created by Kadaena, and in our description of them, they are described as being at least in part demonic. But that part about Kadaena is most likely only a player embellishment. So, we have our Viking archaeological dimension along with the dead god Balder and underworld goddess Hel. Balder is a god so good and fair the light shines from within him. This point is essentially the opposite of Bandr. We also have the weirdness that Bandr would be named after a Norse god, but Kestrel is the one who behaves as a Viking, and Kestrel is the one buried in the Viking ship burial style, with the Balder ship cremation referencing. Since Bandr's crypt is Egyptian-themed, we should expect Kestrel to reflect something Egyptian. That is, as we will see, they are both named for dead gods of the underworld, and their tombs are backwards in style from those points. Bandr should be the one in the burial mound, and Kestrel should be the one in the crypt. But it is the graveyard, and even allegorically, everything is backwards. So, we have the burial mound understood in terms of passage burial and ship burial mythology, with the theory that Bandr is a twisted analog for the Norse dead god Balder, who went to the underworld and is with Hel. This interfaces our Black Hel and dead gods of Aaronmoor subtext with the literal Viking underworld goddess Hel. There seems to be some Viking and Egyptian cross-mixing between the crypt and burial mound. Thraldom in the book title, Kestrel's gold and silver death mask. By the way, when we see something valuable like Kestrel's death mask, it must be cursed in some way. Otherwise it would have been looted by grave robbers a long time ago. The coffin is open, for example, but the mask is not stolen. That coronet is also the crown of a lesser ruler. But that does not really motivate the possibly Celtic stuff with the passage barrow, and the deed priestess Tirwin Beathronion might be named in Welsh. Is there any subtextual interconnection for that? Well, in the end scene of the Dream Quest, when Carter is plummeting into darkness, we do encounter the god Nodens. Nodens is the master of the night gods, who Carter had with him until he reached Kadath, and who had stolen Carter down to the underworld earlier in the story. Nodens in the Dreamlands is the arch-rival of Nyarlathotep. Nodens is also a real-world Brythonic god that Lovecraft imported, since the Dream Quest is inspired by Fey mythology and the elven stories of Lord Dunsany. Lord Dunsany, by the way, invented the Knolls. So, in the Welsh Arthurian legends, the Celtic otherworld is called Annwn, like our castle Annwn, though the spelling is slightly tweaked. And the king of Annwn is Gwyn ap Nudd in the Arthurian legend versions, where Nudd is the Welsh Nodens. That's all very obscure, but we did have that potential stuff with Cerwyn and St. Patrick's Purgatory, so I thought I would mention it. If it were intentional along these lines, we might regard it as backwards, since Bandr, again, is our analog for Nyarlathotep. So, in the Lovecraft frame of reference of Nyarlathotep, we also have the premises of an Egyptian pharaoh and a fallen archangel. That brings us to our next major section. In the Egyptian death religion, the central myth is Osiris, the lord of the underworld. Osiris was the first pharaoh descended from the sun god Ra, where the Saxon kings were descended from Wotan through Bealdig, which is to say Odin through Balder. the Egyptian pharaohs were descended from Ra through Osiris. So that's cool. What is most striking about the Osiris myth is how strongly it resembles the story of Bandur and Kestrel, except some major points of it, of course, are backwards in the Atrivion version. Let's go over the Cliff's Notes of the Osiris myth. Literally, the Cliff's Notes. There are a lot of variations to this legend over the millennia, so doing it this way keeps it simple. Osiris is the first son of Geb and Nut, the god of earth and goddess of the sky. Nug and Yeb, by the way, are the parents of Cthulhu. But when Osiris inherited the rule of Egypt, he persuaded the Egyptians to renounce cannibalism. When he was done establishing law and order, he went on a world journey. He was spreading civilization to other lands. In his absence, the land was ruled by his wife and sister, the goddess Isis. That is, his sister wife, not his wife and his sister. Osiris was tall and handsome. He had an ugly, evil younger brother named Set, a constant schemer and plotter, who envied the power and attractiveness of his older brother. Set was also jealous because Osiris knocked up his own wife, resulting in the jackal-headed Anubis. When Osiris was to return from his long voyage, Set conspired to usurp him. Osiris was trapped in a chest at a banquet and suffocated. Then Set usurped him and became king of Egypt. Usually, in these stories, Osiris has his body mutilated by Set, and it usually happens around this point, though sometimes it's when Set finds the chest later. The chest had been thrown into the Nile, and Isis eventually found it, and with the help of Set's wife was able to revive the dead Osiris enough to impregnate herself with his child. His child, Set's nephew, was Horus. Horus ends up raising an army and overthrowing Set to take back the kingdom of Egypt. Set was driven into the sea, and Horus revived Osiris. The gods decide that Osiris is to be in charge of judging the souls of the dead, and the Egyptian pharaohs descend from Horus as the rightful heir. Osiris becomes the lord of the underworld, and he is the central element of the Egyptian death mythology, because the pharaohs have to meet him in the underworld. So, this is virtually identical to the legend of the Necropolis of Atrivion, except our version leaves out the wives. It has the virtue of explaining what all the cannibalism is about in the graveyard as well, but some of the details are backwards. Set has to be Bandur, and Osiris has to be Kestrel, but Bandur is the one framed as the lord of the underworld. Osiris is the heir of an ancestral land. Kestrel is given a conquered fiefdom to rule over. Set is the envious younger brother. Bandur is the envious older brother. Kestrel's voyage is to raid and plunder, not spread civilization. Bandur usurps him while he was away, not when he gets back. Bandur kills him with a spell of absolution pure, which does no damage to the body, whereas Set mutilates Osiris. Kestrel's sons are never mentioned in the legend, but it is implied they tried to seize it back from Bandur. Except unlike Horus, Set's nephew, Bandur's nephew is apparently lost, and so the Set figure is the lord of the underworld, and the judge of the souls of the dead. What does the name Osiris have to do with the word Kestrel? Well, it's actually kind of obvious set in that context. Kestrels are literally a kind of falcon. Osiris is associated with the sun god Ra as well as his nephew Horus. Ra and Horus are Egyptian falcon gods. That is, they have falcon heads. Osiris is represented as a green man, and Osiris was not only the first pharaoh, but also the first mummy. So the crypt and burial mound are nice and perfectly backwards in that way. The Egyptian death religion is more involved than that story. The fundamental concept is that the dead pharaoh is responsible for journeying through the gates of the underworld. When they reach Osiris, lord of the underworld, that is responsible for the sun being reborn and rising, which is related to the sun god Ra. Ra rises in the east and rides his sun chariot across the sky to the west, where the west is the land of the dead. Notice that you actually do this in the order of Voln's step for foam. You bring the light of the sun down to Bandur, where death sleeps cold, and it lights up the ceiling, which reveals Bandur to be hauled out and not actually vital. The messaging is partly based, I think, on the story of Nirdru from the Shadow World Master Atlas, who burns through with orange light as the unlife has devoured him from within, utterly consuming him. So, in early versions of the Egyptian religion, Set was a protector figure on this sun journey, as Bandar was a protector figure for Kestrel, but he gradually turned into an evil chaos god. The Egyptian pharaohs had mortuary temples with their own cults who were responsible for sacrificing to them, because they needed to be kept fed to make their underworld journey. Otherwise, the sun would fail to rise and the balance of the world was at risk. Notice that when Kestrel dies in the legend, the dawn happens. This doubles up on the burial mound being an overturned warship because of the notion of sailing the sun westward, and it links the crypt to symbolic reasons for the sun being blocked out as well, which it literally is around the crypt. But the Egyptian pharaohs had their own mortuary temples for their role in this death religion. Before they were using pyramids, they were buried in rectangular mastabas. These were constructed from mud bricks, not granite like the crypt. Egyptian monuments came to be made of granite. This raises the question of whether the crypt and the graveyard can be considered archaeologically informed in this context. So, mastabas are oriented north-south like the graveyard. There would be an above-ground part and an underground part of the structure. On the inside would be a central burial chamber with a sarcophagus. The most important thing in the above-ground structure is called a false door in the offering chapel. The false door is a solid slab or tablet of stone with niches that was the threshold between worlds. That is, gods or spirits of the dead could enter the world of the living through the false door. These must always go on the west wall facing the land of the dead, and the graveyard crypt is on the east wall. The false door is where food is offered to the dead pharaoh as sustenance in the afterlife. But this is done symbolically with a symbol of the food on it. They would offer the food by instead using a ritual offering formula that was recited, which was very standard in what it said. They always begin with the word Hotep, in a phrase meaning an offering given by the king, meaning royally authorized. It was then followed by the name of the death god receiving the offering, followed by the title of that death god. It could be to Anubis, he who is on his mountain, for example, as Anubis is a death god. Most commonly it is to Osiris, who has various titles. Osiris, Lord of Abydos, Osiris, Lord of Busiris, and so on. One common version of this is Osiris, Lord of the West. Well, Kestrel is our Osiris figure. What is on Kestrel's coffin? Lord of the West Country. You reach Kestrel's tomb by passing through the false door in the crypt. And what was the offering formula on the crypt's false door? Kadaena Thrak Farak, Kadaena, guardian of the forbidden. This is completely obscured now that the invoking phrase is shadowed by my soul. It no longer has the right form for an offering formula, but that's clearly what it is. The sacrificial offering on the false door of the crypt, as I said, is an imitation of the mystical symbol in the Landing Temple's reincarnation altar. So, in the graveyard, this is twisted into a human sacrifice meaning and relates to the cannibalism. In the bottom level, we see the undead have left Bandar cannibalistic food offerings. That's not all. Mastabas also have a secret hidden room called a Serdab chamber. This is where the valuables are kept. In the graveyard crypt, it is past the false door, in the antechamber that is described as once having been filled with valuables. These rooms exist to house something called a Ka statue that would be flat against the wall. In the crypt, it is instead in the corner. These were necessary for the dead to be able to return to a physical incarnation in this world. They were ceremonially brought to life with the opening of the mouth ceremony, which is about letting the dead eat and drink. I suspect this is why the bone golems were originally inside the crypt, since they are essentially animated undead statues made of bone. The Serdab chamber or anteroom in the crypt was a spot creatures never roamed originally, at least as far back as 1992. The golems mixed with the lesser mummies outside. You might have expected them in this area instead. There are slits or holes so the spirit can move through in the Serdab chamber, located high up just under the ceiling. That's probably why the crypt's false door portal makes you turn into a fine mist, and is probably why the tablet is only nearly up to the ceiling. There are also no inscriptions in those areas, and that's maybe backwards for us. There are iridescent mosaic strips along the walls. These are implied to be the bands of Aranyark that are used for lighting the crypt. I do not know what these stray pieces of metal of unknown purpose are about. Maybe it's something obvious in context, but it's escaping me. Later mastabas had slanted passageways underground leading into an actual tomb chamber. That may be what this ramp is about, leading to Keshel's tomb. What about the outside? Well, the outside details the onslaughts of the unlife throughout history, which for Bandar would be like military victories. It was customary for the outer walls of a mortuary temple to be decorated in this way. It's just that it has a demonic character with Bandar. Consider the mortuary complex in Ramses the Great, the Ramesium, which was built on a northwest to southeast axis. While I cannot say the graveyard is backwards from this example in particular, the basic point is that Egyptian death archaeology can explain the graveyard's northeast axis. That mortuary temple is decorated with battle victories on the outside. Over where the nephews are buried to the east is a green-veined marble obelisk with no decorations on it. There are three things that are wrong about this. First, Egyptian obelisks are typically supposed to come in pairs. They are also related to Ra and the sun. Second, this should have been made out of granite. Bandar is likely spiting them. Third, the decorations portray the history and feats of the dead, and this obelisk is deliberately left undecorated, which implicitly plays into the fact that the nephews are not even mentioned in the legend. In other words, their story essentially has been erased or not recorded. The inscription, as I said, is mockery because the kingdom was not their ancestral land. And though it is called kingdom, it was actually a small fiefdom. There's some miscellany. Cobras by the bog. Cobras are in the Kelborn book for the region, but you generally think Egypt with them. The mummies are obviously playing into the whole Egyptian thing. The story uses words like necropolis and sarcophagus, which we generally associate with the Egyptians, though those words are actually Greek, city of the dead for necropolis, and sarcophagus literally means flesh eater, but who knows if that's even relevant. Obelisk is actually Greek too. So we have a basic theory that Bandar and Keshel are named after dead gods. It is less obvious if Etrivion means anything. Etre could be French for being. Vion could be the Greek vion for life, with the net meaning being alive or something like that. Or it could play off Vion, a French village in horror stories by Clark Ashton Smith, who was a Lovecraft Circle writer, and some of Lovecraft's great old one demon gods came from Clark Ashton Smith, like Tsathoggua. Though that is a stretch, I very much doubt that is intentional. It isn't obvious Etrivion has to mean anything. It's just suggestive when we have so many apparent wordplays. More subtly, the gates of the Underworld in Egyptian funerary texts, like the Book of the Dead and Book of Gates, are goddesses, and they may typically be guarded by two goddesses. This could have something to do with Isis and Kadaena on the graveyard gate. The fundamental symbolic point in the Egyptian frame of reference is that the evil brother is the lord of the underworld, the judger of souls, which could be relevant to our revelation context with deeds, and that this sabotages the sun rebirth. So like the burial mound, it is blocking out the sun. In the Shadow World frame, this might be about Andrax's vision of the unlife, where the sun is blacked out, and as I've emphasized, denying the light path in purgatory, so there's only the dark path, so to speak. That, in a nutshell, is the Egyptian subtext for the design of the graveyard, interlocked through Lovecraft's pharaoh demon, Nyarlathotep. What do Balder and Osiris have in common? They are not only dead gods of the underworld. They are both related to the sun, associated with the seasonal death-rebirth cycle, the ending of the fall and beginning of the spring. It's been thought that Baldur's story started this way and expanded to include the whole world year, becoming instead about Ragnarok, the twilight and rebirth of the gods. This is remarkable in another sense because in Shadowworld, Issa is the goddess of death, winter, and rebirth, though I would caution that this Fraserian dying and rising god of seasonal rebirth thing is rejected by modern scholarship. It was a major interpretive framework in the past. It was very influential. When you have separate texts like this, you cannot control the ways they intersect with each other, even if you are right that the texts were used. With the burial mound in particular, the Salarism would kill all the surrounding animal life in the spring. So it is reasonable to think it might be intended as a symbolic denial of the spring rebirth, which could then be related to these dead god myths. The Celtic dimension for the mound itself is not so clear. Possibly the Morrigan, the death goddess of prophecy and war, foretelling the doom of warriors. She often takes the form of a crow flying over battles, so that could explain the gore crow. But in any case, we have this potential seasonal death and rebirth thread with the dead gods, which could match up with Issa and then Kadaena as a dead goddess. Since we have a dark parallel of the death religion, we might expect that in GemStone at least, Kadaena is a death goddess as well as a goddess of cosmic cycles in some way, similar to the cosmic cycles we see in the end of the Dream Quest. For what it is worth, and it might not be worth much, Kadaena was described this way on player websites in the mid-90s, before her modern description was written. That whole Silent Angel of Death thing before Beyond the Ebon Gate. I only mention this because it is at least conceivable something could have percolated up from the Ice Age, rather than being a pure embellishment by players, maybe something vestigial. In any case, as I mentioned, the Vikings and the Egyptians both buried boats, though the Vikings used them as coffins. There is an especially large example of this, the Khufu ship from the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Egyptians seem to have used boats as funerary barges as well. In the Egyptian death religion, Ra sails his boat across the sky, the sun. I might have called it a sun chariot earlier, as more Indo-European. With the Egyptians, the sun vessel was a boat. So these solar barks or solar barges are symbolically important in Egyptian death rites. They're about the pharaoh sailing with Ra through the sky in Underworld. The Underworld, of course, is at night in the west. They have to pass through the gates of the Underworld, knowing the names of the gate goddesses. Then they meet Osiris with Ra, which revitalizes Ra. The sun cycle is the death and rebirth of Ra, essentially, and then Ra is reborn, swallows the stars. The sky pushes him back out. The dawn. That's what is symbolically denied in the graveyard, with Bandar underground and Kestrel's overturned warship pointed east. So we have the Set figure as the judge of the souls of the dead, and a Judgment Day theme with purgatory. That brings us to the last major subtext. In the Lovecraft frame of reference, Nyarlathotep is a cross between a pharaoh and a fallen archangel. So our last fallen god, Lord of the Underworld figure, is Satan. Lucifer, of course, is the Lightbringer, associated with the dawn, and Venus, the morning star. I've already mentioned some of the major elements from Dante's Inferno that have immediate parallels in the graveyard. The most obvious ones are the graveyard gate and Bandar being frozen in ice deep underground. Inferno is the first third of Dante's Divine Comedy, where Dante is guided by the poet Virgil through Inferno, down to Satan, and then up to the other side of the earth. They climb up the mountain of Purgatory. Dante has to purify his sin with the river Lethe at the top. Then Beatrice guides Dante through paradise until Dante eventually meets God. Purgatory as a mountain is purely Dante's invention. So even though the gemstone death mechanics are named Purgatory, and the graveyard is symbolizing that, it's Dante's Inferno that is being paralleled, not his Purgatorio. though the Volt Monastery uses river life water like Lethe in Purgatorio, for getting away all the worldly pollutions and corruptions, essentially. But that could easily be a coincidence. So, Inferno is divided up into 9 circles, each corresponding to a sin, with the more serious sins deeper underground. The sun is silent in Inferno, so to speak. It is a sticking point that the light of God does not reach down into Inferno. There are 100 chapters in the Divine Comedy called cantos, where each major section is 33 cantos long. The Divine Comedy is written in what is called a 9+1 structure, or really even 3+1 is a recurring motif in the poem. Boccaccio's Decameron is similarly 9+1, but 9 is the big important number. So, the original 1990 parts of the graveyard consist of 90 rooms, with 3 major layers of depth. Each conceptually distinct section of the original graveyard is 9 rooms, plus 1 transition room when bridging the next section. Shut up. No. No way. Yes, way. This only works if you limit yourself to the parts of the graveyard from 1990, though it's slightly more complicated around the bog. Instead of 9+1, that's 18+2, because it's really 2 concept areas put together. The forest maze fits this rule as well. You can do the Hansel and Gretel thing, dropping stuff in the woods to count how many rooms are in it. As you can see, this map is labeled with infernal landmarks, forming a loose parallel. I will be doing another walkthrough of the graveyard. This time it will be in sequence with Dante's Inferno, identifying which parts might have been used for the graveyard. As I keep saying, the parallel has to break down at some point, so only some things will matter. Which also means that even if the fundamental point is right, specific examples can still be coincidences. The crypt and inner burial mound rooms seem to have almost nothing to do with Dante, but they do adhere to this rule for the room counts. The surface level and deep underground, on the other hand, are very heavily parallels to Inferno. So let's start with the beginning, where Dante is having a dream vision in Canto 1 when he starts his dream quest. He finds himself lost in the gloomy woods, unable to find the straight way. In the Longfellow translation, it's instead path direct and true path. Notice that the word gloomy is used in the forest maze. The straight way is a metaphor, following the right path, and Dante is beset by beasts representing vices: leopard, lion, and she-wolf. Dante was ascending a hill and driven back by the she-wolf. The forest maze in Gemstone, on the other hand, is devoid of creatures, and you have to head straight northeast to not be lost in it. The she-wolf ensnares and kills all the things. Instead, we have creeping widowwort or dirge veon vines at the corresponding spot, which ensnares people passing through. Notice that in this translation, the she-wolf is never at peace. That is the phrase used in Kestrel's epitaph. This is on the cusp of a great desert where Dante meets Virgil. The graveyard is on the edge of a vast desert, the high plateau. Then in Canto 2, Virgil tells Dante that Beatrice was sent by him, by the Virgin Mary's messenger, St. Lucia. St. Lucia is the patron of the blind and martyrs. But Beatrice pleads with Virgil to find Dante and help him find the straight way. Consider the same Longfellow translation of it. Beatrice am I who do bid thee go. I come from there where I would fain return. That is, she's saying she comes from heaven and has to go back. Virgil has to go to Dante and help him through Inferno. Now look at the stilted speech Banner gives his high priest at the end of the legend, and cut out the middle lines. There's a place that calls me where I must go. With that, he uttered a spell of returning. Beatrice am I who do bid thee go. I come from there where I would fain return. It is remarkably similar, but backwards. Bander is returning to a hell. Spell of returning is a pretty weird phrase, and this could explain it effortlessly, though Word of Return admittedly is also a spell from spell law. That was the original name of 130, what we call Spirit Guide. It's essentially a gold ring function in spell law. Calls Me could also come from the last line of Lovecraft's Ex Oblivion, that native infinity of crystal oblivion from which the demon life had called me. So, Virgil is guiding Dante for the three blessed ladies in Canto 2. This is immediately before they encounter the Gate of Inferno. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Recall that our purgatory messaging describes the other side as hopelessness. There are, of course, two goddesses on the graveyard gate. As I pointed out repeatedly, the graveyard gate looks like it is in flames because of the corrosion of its iron spikes. Earlier in this series, I illustrated it with Rodin's Gates of Hell sculptures, loosely inspired by Inferno. This is a straightforward invocation of a Gate of Hell concept. In some translations, the word phantom appears in Virgil's speech, but I'm not inclined to think that matters. I think the point of the phantoms in the graveyard is their lack of memory and oblivion. Frustratingly, from 1995 onward in the Rolemaster Beast series, phantoms are the result of being imprisoned in eternal hopelessness, which would have fit perfectly with the abandon all hope and the hopelessness in GemStone's purgatory messaging, but it was not there yet in the books from the 1980s, so it is nothing more than coincidence. So, there are 9 circles to Inferno, representing major categories of sin. Deeper circles are greater sins, especially 6 through 9. The punishments for sins are poetic. Generally, they are inversions of the sin in some sense as punishment, backwards or otherwise fitting for the sin. Seers trying to know the future, for example, are condemned to have their heads on backwards, walking in circles for eternity. This might be the root of the everything is backwards inversion theme for the graveyard. Before the first circle is the vestibule of hell. This is for the souls who cannot choose, so to speak. It has the angels who try to stay neutral in the war in heaven. More generally, the vestibule includes people concerned only for themselves, the uncommitted who chose no sides. This is interesting because GemStone's Purgatory has the spirits who cannot choose, that is, between the light and darkness, seemingly forever. Those are punished in the vestibule of hell with stinging wasps and maggots sinking into their feet. So then there's the river Acheron to the first circle. The first circle is Limbo. This place isn't actually bad. It's where the virtuous pagans are, the people Dante liked who were before Christ. It's a castle with high walls and a rivulet next to it at the edge of the light. The wording here is similar to the outside room with the sun blocked out, where the sounds of life are absorbed, though it's a stretch. Either way, the inside of the crypt seems to not matter, and the lower circles are maybe composited on the outside. The second circle, lust, isn't really present in an obvious way, though you could twist arguments for it. It talks about blindness, for example, and the goblins are blinded by the sun, and the phantoms are described as blind. There's the Empress of many languages, and you have Empress Kadaena, and so on. The third circle, gluttony, is any sort of addiction, the sinners wallowing in slush and mire. This could correspond to the lesser ghouls who in the ice books live in swamps, but gluttony could more literally be the skeletons inverted from excessive eating. The fourth circle, greed, is hoarders and spendthrifts hurling heavy objects at each other. This could be the lesser ghouls as well, since they are implicitly grave robbers. Goblins with their flails, if you want to push it from that angle, too. So the first few circles are only weakly present, if at all. The graveyard is constructed in circles. There's the circle around the crypt and the circle around the burial mound on the surface level. Then the shallow underground has those same things nested within those circles. Then the deep underground does as well, the undercrypt and underbarrow. That's 6 circles. The bog and creek area arguably counts as 2 circles, one nested in the other. That is, the paths form most of a ring around the bog, then the creek closes the ring, making the bog a circle within a larger circle. except backwards from Inferno, as the fifth circle is a swamp that surrounds all the circles after it, which are all inside the walls of the city of Dis. Then the forest maze up to the gates is not a circle per se, but it's the ninth section. The Inferno parallel is more clear after this point. So, the fifth circle is the river Styx, which is actually a huge swamp surrounding the city of Dis. The fifth circle is Wrath. The wrathful are doomed to constantly fight forever, while the sullen, wrath turned inward, are submerged under the swamp water. The graveyard bog is the fifth circle. The original part from 1990 has 5 rooms. It's a flooded cemetery, so bodies are under the water. Dirges, as we covered in episode 2, are depressed bards in Rolemaster. In GemStone, they had battle axes and visored helms, though they no longer have the visored helms for some reason. And when they were given creature descriptions, they were painted as angry soldiers constantly fighting forever. So this is a fusion of the wrath and sullen concepts like in the fifth circle. The Infernal frame of reference naturally explains it. From 1995 onward, ghouls in Rolemaster actually submerged themselves in swamps in the daytime to avoid the sun. Unfortunately, this is not explicitly stated in 1989 or earlier, only that they reside in swamps. But overall, it fits well enough with the fifth circle. Beyond the fifth circle, Dante and Virgil approach the gate of the city of Dis, and the fallen angels slam the door on them. They are offended that someone of the living has been brought down there and blocked the way. Virgil tells them they have no right to do that, and so on and so on. Then a raging heavy power comes down over the swamp and blasts it open. So we have right next to the bog the knocked over dolmen, which might have been a magical portal originally. Because as I pointed out, the Lords of Essence sometimes made portals out of stone trilithons. The way it is worded is that it looks like it was upended with demonic strength and fury. That is backwards, blasted closed instead of open, by demons rather than heavenly powers. But the parallel is clear. Being a portal dolmen, it should lead into Keshel's Mound in principle. The sixth circle is heretics, who burn forever in their tombs. Keshel has the whole Viking theme and the chimney. There are 6 rooms along the bottom, leading from the bog up to the knocked over dolmen, and there are 7 rooms along the top for the 7th circle, 5 plus 6 plus 7, 18, and 2 bridging rooms. The 7th circle is for the violent, which has suffered an earthquake from the time of Christ's death and the harrowing of hell. In the graveyard, this corresponds to all the felled trees that formed the natural dam which flooded the bog. This is where the river Phlegethon is. It has the violent to others and the suicides. The violent against others are submerged and covered in boiling blood. Recall from the second episode that I said the blood beasts would have been somewhere around here because they were level 7. And they are covered in blood, but unlike in Rolemaster, they would burn you by flinging corrosive blood. Then you have the suicides. As I mentioned, the revenants are suicides in Rolemaster, but in GemStone their flesh is torn up, as if they were tortured to death by someone else, and this is where the revenants are found in the graveyard. The suicides in the 7th circle are trapped in the form of thorns and trees. Harpies, which are essentially bird women, are tearing their flesh out. The Gorkrows are carrion crows. They may be doing it to corpses literally. This could explain the choice of spinewood tree thickets by the natural dam and dried up creek, as well as the cobras, as that section of text also speaks of the soul of serpents. Their sad plantings could also explain the siren flowers in the bog. The river also gets more shallow until Dante and Virgil eventually cross it safely at a ford. This would explain the dried out creek bed just past the natural dam. Then to approach the 8th circle, they had to pass through the burning plains, which is an unbearable desert with flames of rain sometimes. This would loosely correspond to the high plateau in the graveyard, which is, of course, right by the burial mound. The 8th circle is every manner of fraud, From bribers to sorcerers to thieves to evil advisors and sowers of discord. It is the upper half of the fraud section and is called malabulge, which means the evil ditches. These represent the corruption and decay of every aspect of a city. Notably, the demons punishing corrupt politicians are the malabranch, the evil claws. They keep the sinners submerged in boiling pitch. In the second episode, I pointed out that white and gemstones strongly deviate from how they are in Rolemaster. In Rolemaster, they are non-corporeal, undead nobles like Nazgul. In Gemstone, they are corporeal cannibals with sadistic claws. This would explain why White Lords, now Arc-Whites, have claws and cast Boil Earth, which is Gemstone specific and does not come from Rolemaster. It's the evil claw demons in their boiling pitch. The Shadow Assassins would presumably be related to the political corruption represented by the Eighth Circle. Nothing obvious jumps out to me from Inferno for their invisibility or weapon fire. But it is in the Eighth Circle that there is a steep descent into the lowest part of Inferno, just as there is a steep descent from the Manor level to the Frozen section. The lowest part of Inferno, the Ninth Circle, is frozen, the frozen lake of Cocytus. This is where the various kinds of betrayers and traitors are punished. Traitors to kin, country, guests, liege lords, and God. Vander fits all the kinds of treachery. Traitors are frozen in ice in the Ninth Circle. The worst are totally encased in ice. This is where Satan is, and he is represented as Hell's monarch, with the whole thing compared to a castle. Satan is blowing cold wind out from himself, which only freezes him further. We see the cold winds in the graveyard's deep undergrounds, and that it is a mockery of a medieval castle. Satan looks like only his lower half is frozen, but it is an illusion. He's actually totally frozen inside ice. Dante and Virgil climb up his back, and gravity flips as they are now on Earth's opposite hemisphere, having passed through the center of the Earth. That's not how gravity works, but it was the 1300s. Dante gets credit for the round Earth. Then they see Satan's legs as unfrozen, and his top half is frozen. Interestingly, in the Carey translation, this spot uses the phrase errors thraldom. And I've talked about there being a thrall next to Bander in the Ice Room, as well as his book title, Power Through Thraldom. When you see this room lit up in the phone step for the Order of Voln, the wording actually looks quite similar to this scene. Those frozen in ice are frail stems or straws in glass, depending on the translation, and it describes Bander as a hollow shell as everything becomes translucent. But they climb up Satan's back. It's likened to stairs, which explains why you walk upstairs to reach the ice room, where Bander is frozen in the block of ice. Then Dante and Virgil walk up a cavern, which is like no palace hall, and has dim lighting. This explains the medieval manner of the purgatory level and the glowing fungus. It is described as a natural dungeon with ill footing. And in the graveyard you almost lose your footing when you're climbing out of the frozen part. Dante and Virgil are walking along a river that is implicitly the river Lethe, which is the river of oblivion flowing down from purgatory, freezing Satan in Cocytus. It is implied by its sound and reinforced in Purgatorio. Then they reach the other side of the earth, where Dante sees constellations he has never seen before, which more directly explains the unknown constellations in the Purgatory throne room. This is the point where Dante's Inferno ends, and they begin to travel up the mountain of Purgatory. Purgatory is a mountain in Dante because when Satan fell, the impact formed Inferno. So it gets narrower and narrower as you get deeper. Then the displaced earth formed Purgatory. But in the graveyard there was no path up to the surface, so this is symbolically denied. The path only exists now because people clawed their way up from underground. That raises the question of whether the medieval manor section should be considered the Eighth Circle or the ascent from Satan. It might very well be both, since space is warped, but more literally it is the ascent from Satan. So that, in a nutshell, is the Dante's Inferno parallel to the graveyard. The parallel to Dante's Inferno is quite strong, stronger than just a few of its most obvious similarities. There may be a detailed parallel to it encoded in the various creatures and plants in the room painting. The deeper you go, the greater the sin, and the more powerful the monster in the graveyard. Specific points might be coincidental, but on the whole, it is pretty clear that it is really there, so to speak. Each of these major subtexts is very difficult to shake as a theory. That they are united in a single theme is striking. It is also remarkable that our Balder and Osiris theory explains one vertical level of the graveyard, and the Dante's Inferno theory explains the other two vertical levels of the graveyard, but there is almost no overlap between them. Similarly, the deep context of Shadow World we explored in the third episode, with the Black Hell and all that, really only applies to that middle level, maybe even more specifically the crypt. It's not relevant anywhere else in the graveyard. Maybe that is revealing some contours on different people working on different parts of it. It's impossible to say without being able to look under the hood. They might just be conceptually different. Lovecraft is primarily only relevant in the deep underground, or at least that is where it is obvious. But it is quite remarkable that the ending of the Dream Quest so neatly motivates the various frames of reference for the graveyard, as well as the death mechanics messaging, which the graveyard parallels in still other ways. So we have a reasonably unified theory in allegorical interpretation. Dead gods of the underworld and death religions, with Kadaena as a dark mirror of Issa, with a rival prophecy for the fate of souls, with the sun being blocked out, meaning without the light path, so there's only the dark path of the theocracy. The eschatology of the apocalyptic elements fits the unlife wanting to self-annihilate with the essence. There is also a dream quest and harrowing of the underworld theme to it all, which might be a reason the dream quest of Unknown Kadath was used. Some aspects of this could be considered in character, Bander's grand design, so to speak. Other parts are more purely allegorical, and Bander cannot reasonably be said to have been designing with that intent. But that is taking things too seriously in a sense, with the IC and OOC separation. The other parts of the graveyard do not fit this theory. There is a thin case for relating the 1998 expansion of the Burial Mound to subtexts for Shadow Valley. I'm not especially convinced of it, but it is not impossible. I will cover that if I do one of these for Shadow Valley. The expansion to the crypt was part of the Town Undertaker grave robbing story from the mid-90s. That part of the crypt architecturally makes no sense. Slither Creek doesn't mean anything. The burial grounds don't seem to mean anything. Don't know what that pentagram is about. One interesting thing is the Mormont-Slough expansion, which implies there is more underground construction. There is a partly excavated slab with a prayer in some obscure language to Gosina. It seems like maybe something smashed through the wall. That is, the excavators maybe set off a trap. But the language is the ancient Elven dialect that was sometimes used in the early 2000s. I do not believe players ever had access to a glossary for it. It's not Uraric. I've tried from that angle. I doubt there's a cipher rule for it. Similar phrases appear in the Marlu Talisman war song from the Hunt for History. The language was also used in storylines such as the Vishmir Incident, which was the release of the day-night system. Former GM Varaviel told me the language was kept and maintained by GM Ilshi. It looks like her name should be pronounced El Sidhi, but it's Gaelic. I think it's pronounced more like Elshi. Bane Sidhi, for example, is pronounced Banshee. Gaelic itself isn't helpful. That's actually the English pronunciation of Gaelic, not the Irish or Scottish pronunciations of it. But maybe some GMs from around then have some of the translations of that language saved. I do not know what the writing on the slab means, but I would guess it's just boilerplate, the general kind of stuff you would expect for Kadaena. Stuff about death, eternity, or whatever. From shared context, the last parts of it should constitute some sort of prayer, maybe a ritual chant for Kadaena. This is interestingly a non-teleportable room, but with the modern mechanics for that property, so it still works. There's also a slab that seems like it could open, in principle, away from the excavation site. Piercing gaze does not misfire on it. So I'm wondering if there was maybe a concept for expanding this place underground and it never happened. But either way, it is not part of the grand design of the graveyard. But that, in a nutshell, is my theory for the grand design of the graveyard. Individual points of it might be unintentional, even if overall it's basically right. Whether it is right or wrong, it is a very solid theory, and it is not ridiculous. That's the best we can really hope for without knowing the authorial intent. I'm hyper-conservative with history, lore, documentation, and all that. Eternal consistency of the world logic, as you can tell from how I split apart when things were made and by whom. Engaging when we should write it off as ill-defined. Unfortunately, sometimes there's more cryptic stuff there, and you cannot unsee it. You come across something and say, that's weird. So you scratch it and identify possible patterns, maybe a higher concept. Then there's no choice but to try to theorize it. Ideally some basic premise that explains or predicts a whole array of specific details. Substantial chunks of it will be right, if it was intended by the authors. Some of it will be coincidence, even if it's basically right. You can only figure things out by being willing to hazard getting some of it wrong. Because, after all, the authorial intent is not the only interpretation. I'm not the Ancient Aliens guy, though. If you try to do this with GemStone, I will probably think you're imagining hidden messages in the television static. Most of the stuff that could fit something is not really there, so to speak. You have to kill ideas. Keep only what won't die. In this case, we have something very difficult to dismiss, and parts of it seem to be relevant to other areas of GemStone. If I do more of these historical exploration series on certain other mysterious realms of GemStone, this theory of the graveyard will be the basis for interpreting them. Thank you for watching my historical exploration series on the graveyard. Hopefully you learned something worth knowing, because knowing is opening up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age.